So I'd like to start asking about the beginning of the concept of the show and when you started writing it, like, because Willow has premiered almost 35 years ago. And when the opportunity to produce the series came up, what creative avenues you felt were open for it?
Well, it's funny. It's in Hollywood, IP and established properties are always a big thing. You seek that borrowed interest, particularly in this cultural moment when there's so many new shows and movies vying for the attention of the audience. Some recognition is a valuable asset. But what you really want, the golden goose of this whole thing, is a piece of IP that promises more stories, that feels like it's rich in potential. And with Willow, what you had was a movie that ended with the most powerful baby on an entire planet being left in the care of Val Kilmer and Joanne Whalley, who were not her parents, And for me, that resonated and reminded me of the opening of Harry Potter and a lot of fantasy stories I loved. And I thought there was nothing but potential in the story of Elora Danan, and perhaps, many seasons of television or many movies about what being a young sorceress with enormous power means. And I think it has thematic elements that are very relatable as a young person growing up and trying to sort of reconcile your own power in the world.
Awesome. So this mystery revolving Elora Danan, was it something that you felt like you wanted to tackle very early on, or was it something that
instantly
came up along the way?
Instantly. I mean, it was the reason that I wanted to do this. And even when I met Warwick, when I met Ron, it was never a question of like, did we want just to have more Willow? We knew we wanted to continue the story the movie was telling, to see what happened to that child, to see the threats out there in the world that were greater than Queen Bevmorda, and to set this child against those threats.
Awesome. Speaking about Warwick, his character now, Willow Lovegood, is an older and wiser now, and with a whole new set of characters that look up to him, which I think it probably is a big difference from the original movie, where everybody was like looking down to him and not take him for granted. So what do you think that were the main differences in writing this character from the show related to the movie?
Well, I'll tell you the honest truth, which is that when my father started out in this industry, he was Willow. He was a young screenwriter with potential and energy and vigor. And now he is a much older and accomplished screenwriter who's got his regrets and his joys and his triumphs and all of it, and an incredible sense of humor about the whole thing. And I thought that if Willow could capture a little of that feeling, it would feel true and authentic to the life of an artist or a public servant who's had a lot of different kinds of experiences, and they aren't all simple.
Awesome. So if you have this parallel with Willow and your father, could we make the same parallel about the new set of characters that are joining him and yourself?
Absolutely. And Elora, the story of Elora Danan and the journey she goes through is deeply connected to what I have experienced as someone trying to learn to be a writer. I equate writing and imagination with a kind of magic, and mastering those powers and that energy is really what the show is all about, and how you make it your own. So you wrestle with the influences of your mentors, you wrestle with the power inside you, and in the end, you hope to manage it with as much clarity and quality as possible.
Speaking about this new set of characters that we have accompanying Willow in this adventure, they all seem to be this unlikely gang of adventurers, just as the movie's group of protagonists were. So in which ways do you think this cast echoes the spirit of the movie's cast, and in which ways do you think they bring something new to the story?
What Val Kilmer brought to Mad Mardigan was so original in 1988. There'd never been anything like him in a fantasy franchise before, nor Kevin Pollak or even Joanne to some extent. They all felt exciting and fresh and sexy and young. And we wanted to keep that spirit very much alive in Willow, the series. So we knew we had to deliver on that same promise, but in 2022. And what we did was we assembled a group of actors who felt contemporary and fresh and could bring their comedy and their personality to this show and play it off of Warwick's, which was so solid and grounding, and let them sort of flutter around him in a mess of flies that he's constantly having to swat away. And that felt like the potential setup for a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, since we're talking about Madmartigan, his character is this noted absence from the show, and I read other interviews where you said that you talked with Val and how you wanted his character to be felt present. So how challenging it was to make such an important character present in this story, even though the actor is absent?
I wouldn't say it was largely challenging, because it was always going to be designed in such a way where one of the central quests of the season was the search for Madmartigan, what had happened to him, what he'd sacrificed for the good of Elora Danan and for the good of his family, and what his priorities were. Those questions were ones we knew we needed from the get-go as engines for the story. But the payoff to those questions was more of a question of, it was more of an issue of when we were going to pay those questions off and how. And while we briefly considered just immediately paying them off in season 1, when it became clear that Val wasn't going to be coming out to work with us in the heat of COVID, we simply pushed off those questions, left them sort of as mysteries toward the end of the season, but deepened them by adding Christian Slater's character to the mix and letting him provide some insight into where Madmartigan has gone, where his journey has led him, and where he might be waiting down the road for Kit and Eric and all the characters in the show.
For my last question, Willow, in this great Lucasfilm tradition, has this expanded universe material in the form of the novels in the 90s, the Chronicles of the Shadow War by George Lucas and Chris Claremont. This show doesn't seem to it seems to be more directly tapping from the movie story, like a direct continuation from the movie, but were the novels some sort of inspiration for the show in any way?
Well, I read the novels, certainly, and I was interested to sort of explore what of it was actually generated by George. And when I started to delve into that mystery, it became clear that very little of it had actually come from George, and that the large part of it was that Chris Claremont had an idea for some fantasy novels. He had an opportunity to work with Lucasfilm Publishing after those novels had been written, and some very sort of cursory changes had been made to bring them into the Willow universe. And when it was explained to me just that way, I felt less beholden to the material in them and more liberated to sort of take the story where we all collectively felt it would best go on television. And I know, there's a lot of affection for those novels, and I think they stand, like much expanded universe stuff, on their own as a great journey you can take off into these characters' lives. But we're hopeful that the show feels like a true continuation in every way of the movie that was made.
Perfect. Well, Jon, thank you so much for this interview. A lot of success and best of luck.
Great talking to you.